Well, let's stop on our way at Psalm 137. It's the opposite of the new song that on our way through we can see it, and I'm afraid that's where I have been, what I've been singing some days is this one he talks about. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. Some of the ladies here this week were talking about the days when they were first saved and how the two couples together were just in the Word continually, and they were laying hands on people, and they were seeing God move, and it was just awesome. And I think every one of us would have a testimony like that to one degree or another, just that excitement of the new love. But then we start on that journey through the wilderness, which is the purpose of the wilderness journey is to show us our heart. God already knows our heart, but we don't know it until our heart is tested through the things that we go through. So by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? I think all of us have been walking through some strange lands, places we haven't been before. There are no familiar guideposts about how to handle these situations that we're going through, except Him. He remains steadfast. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. So, have you hung your harp on a willow tree and refused to sing the songs of Zion? I have. I can remember once in particular. You know, we hate to be shaken out of what's familiar, even if what's familiar is not the happiest place in the world. We hate being shaken out of what is familiar, right? Well, in 1981, Cleveland, Tennessee was familiar to me. And God had begun that year to use Milt just in an awesome way, starting in 1980. And he began to go out and teach, and he came home and told me that God had told him that we were to move to Fort Worth. And I said, good, you go on. You go on, because I like it here where I am, and you can come back and visit me. Well, he hadn't been gone too long until I realized I didn't like that at all. So we moved to Fort Worth, and I didn't know what depression was. You know, as the Lord brings a lot of things to mind just as you, in the last 30 minutes, he's just reminded me, you know, in 1934, February, I was born the 10th child into a poor family out in the country. And there were triplets born the year before I was, but they didn't live very long. So I was the youngest. I grew up the youngest of 7. And when I was 9 months old, my mother died. She was not sickly. She just became sick on Friday and died on Sunday morning with I guess it would have been a cerebral hemorrhage, but just an infection in her ear that went to her brain. She died. And so 7 little children, the youngest, the oldest was 13, and we were raised in the country, poor as could be. Don't know how we made it except the grace of God. And I can remember different ones in the family saying, well, we don't have much, but at least we got our pride. They didn't know they were saying, we don't have much, but we're cursed on top of that. But that's how I grew up. And I was just thinking tonight, I hadn't thought about it before. But you know, back in those days, people didn't latch on to not having a mother as an excuse for not living life to the fullest. Have you all noticed the change? Anyway, I just thought about that and thought, well, God, you were faithful. I didn't have a mother, but you somehow took care of all of us back then. But anyway, back to 1981, Milton heard the call, and I had to go with him. And I've never known what depression was. I'd never had the luxury of having time to be depressed. And so I got to Fort Worth, and the only thing that was different, I was sleeping a lot. And after a little while, after maybe 4 or 5 months, I realized, I think there's something wrong. And then when I thought about it, I was just not pleased with God. He had taken me out of everything that was familiar and had put me, you know, Milt and I back in Cleveland lived on the main street, and it wasn't a big town, and everybody knew we loved the Lord, and they knew we were fanatics, but they liked us, most of them. But we moved out there to Fort Worth into a church where, you know, my husband was known for casting out devils, and lots of them didn't like that. So I think for the first time in my life, I was aware of rejection. You know, I just grew up thinking, for the most part, everybody liked me, and if they didn't, that would have to be their problem. But rejection just because of the way God was using us. And just the shaking I didn't like, and I guess I just went into depression and began to sleep a lot, but I didn't know I was depressed. And so one day Milt was going to go to Houston for a few days, and I thought, well, I'm going to get with God. I'm going to get this thing resolved. And, you know, sort of humbly, I was saying, Lord, what is it? And he said, what's the difference between an oak and a weeping willow? And I remember thinking, well, that's not a very spiritual question. You know, I'm trying to get right with you, and we're doing riddles. But I thought about it, and I said, well, they're both often planted by a river of waters, but the weeping willow's roots don't go down very deep. The oak's roots go down deep, but the weeping willow's roots don't go down very deep, and in a storm or a big wind, it's likely to be uprooted. And a weeping willow's leaves are like this, and an oak's leaves are like this. And the Lord just stopped me and said, you have been a weeping willow, but I created you to be an oak of righteousness. And he told me then to read Isaiah 61, which it's familiar to you, but let's just read it, because it's not, this was about the Lord, but it's also about us who are willing to be his disciples. Starting in verse 1, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees or oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. You know, and then he took me back to Psalm 137. He said, that's where you've been, but you're moving into Isaiah 61. And then I went back to Psalm 138, verse 4, and he said, in the day when I cried, thou answered me and strengthened me with strength in my soul.